excuse me. If I could get everyone's attention, if they could, folks could sit down and we can get ready. We said we start at 7, and we want to try to start at 7:01. Your time is valuable, and I appreciate those folks who have been able to get here, and we'll certainly make room for everybody else who comes in. My name is Alan Kittleman. I'm the Howard County Executive, and I want to thank you for being here tonight. I want to thank you for your support over this long process of 10 months now, and for all that you have worked with us on. And before I say anything else, I want to acknowledge Council Chair John Weinstein. He could not be here tonight. He is actually in New York getting the Hugh O'Brien Youth Leadership Award. I forgot how Jesse, or you might know this. Yeah, I think he deserves an applause for that. It's a national organization. He's actually up in New York City tonight getting that award. So he's showing Howard County pride up in New York City tonight. So, but I definitely, he wants to be here, but that's something he definitely could not miss. And I just want to also, there are a lot of folks here who have been very involved since the beginning, whether through the CAG process or others, the flood group, and I want to thank everybody for being such a big part of what's been happening so far. Tonight's an important night. We have several things to talk about tonight. We'll have several people to speak and have an opportunity for people to ask questions. But again, this is the beginning of a process that continues, the beginning of the master plan process and the beginning of hearing about the results of the H&H study, but also talking about how we can move forward. So again, I want to continue to make sure you understand that we're going to continue to have the community involved in every step of the way. We could not have been where we are now without all of your involvement. We could have not known best how to proceed without your involvement, and we look forward to continue to make that happen. So you don't need to hear from me anymore. I want to make sure we get Steve up here to begin the discussion. I'll be here this evening later on as well, but we have a lot of folks to give you information and to answer some questions that you might have. So it's Steve right over here, and I just want to thank Steve. He has been around, and he has been so helpful. And also, before you come up, I just know Delegate Flanagan is here. Thank you very much, Bob. I did not acknowledge you at first. Delegate Flanagan has been here from the beginning as well and helping us tremendously, and I know working with the state to make sure that we could get the support we got from the state of Maryland. So with that, though, I'll turn it over to Steve, again, who's helped us so much with the public engagement process. Steve.
Great. Thank you, County Executive Kittleman, and thank you for your leadership throughout this whole process. Good evening, everyone. As the County Executive said, our firm has been involved in the public engagement process since last Labor Day. It's great to still be involved, to see this process march forward, and we're delighted to be able to launch the master plan process officially tonight, and also to share with you what has come out of the hydrology and hydraulics study. So let me just briefly share 4 points here in terms of the purpose of tonight, because we have a lot to cover in just a couple of hours. So as you all know, I want to make sure I'm standing in the right place so I don't get sound interference here. So, the fall and the winter have really been going through the late stage recovery process, getting us to a place where we really can begin a master planning process. So there's lots of intensive study that's gone on. The hydrology and hydraulic study you're going to hear about tonight was literally just completed a few weeks ago. And so now we can move into an active planning process, building upon the great input and recommendations that you made in the many meetings that we held last fall. So tonight we're really here to begin to understand what the master plan is, what it will do for Ellicott City going forward, what that process will look like over the next 9, 10, 11 months, and how it can shape the future that we want to see for Ellicott City going forward. We'll also get a chance to really delve into the findings from the hydrology and hydraulic study, which is known affectionately as the H&H, if you hear people refer to it, and how it links to, integrates with, and informs the master plan process going forward. So there have been lots of important, it's been an important study, important modeling that's happened, but it will continue to move with the master plan process to allow us to figure out what's going to make sense for the watershed and for the city going forward. And also at the very end of the meeting, we'll remind you on what are the most immediate next steps for the master plan process and how you can get involved and stay involved. So the agenda tonight is really pretty simple. You're going to hear from Tom, where's Tom? Tom McGilloway from Mahan Reichel, the master plan firm that was chosen for this. He's going to give you a presentation that gives you kind of the basic structure of what is a master plan, the experience that they bring to the table, their whole team, and what the process will look like, what the schedule will look like, and then we'll have a short period of time where you'll be able to answer or ask a few questions, and he and his team will take those questions and answer them. Then the majority of this meeting will really be focused on the hydrology and hydraulic study that we have all been waiting for over the past months. And this is a really important study. Obviously, we'll have a lot of implications for the watershed going forward. And Chris is going to be, from McCormick Taylor, is going to be giving a two-part presentation. There's going to be a short presentation kind of giving you some of the bare bones, a short opportunity for Q&A, and then he'll delve a lot more into the kind of the modeling results from that study, and there will be a more extensive Q&A period that will occur after that. So there will be three periods of time during this meeting tonight where you'll get a chance to ask questions and have those answered. And then at the very end of the meeting, we will do next steps, let you know what's happening next going into the summer. I do want to say a short word about the Q&A process. So when it's time for Q&A, we're going to ask folks to line up here at this microphone stand. So if you have questions, we're not going to be able to take a microphone out into the audience. You're going to need to line up behind here. There are going to be time limits to the Q&A so that we can make sure that we get you out of here on time, but we'll take as many as we possibly can at each juncture. We're going to ask you to keep your questions as succinct as possible. That way we can take more of them along the way. So keeping your comments short and really focused in on what questions do you have, either to clarify or to deepen your own understanding. So very quickly, before we move to the first presentation, let me just ask a quick question. So, and raise your hands. We don't have the polling devices tonight. So did you participate in one of the fall recovery meetings that we did September, October, November, December last fall? Just raise your hand if you were involved. So probably a good 2/3 of you have. So it's great to have everyone back, and also great to have lots of new folks. Second and final question is, do you live or work or own property in the watershed? And the watershed, I don't know if you can see it here, and Tom will give you a better definition of it, but it's essentially, it's reaching up past 29 to the north. It's extending down to down here, the Worthington Dog Park, Newcut Road. So with regard to the watershed, do you either live or work or own property within the watershed? So we have a lot of direct stakeholders here tonight. That's great to see. So thank you very much. With that, I am going to bring up Val Lasdens, who you all probably know is the director of the Department of Planning and Zoning, and he's going to give you a little bit of an overview of the master planning firm. Take it over, Val. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Steve. I just want to kind of reiterate County Executive Kittleman thanking you for being here. This is really an important step, not only for the Department of Planning and Zoning, who's helping lead this effort, but for the county in general. So we're about to embark on a long-term planning effort for the Ellicott City area as well as the watershed that Steve just talked about. After the 2016 flood, the goal was to bring Ellicott City back to a state of normalcy as soon as possible. And that involved repairing and stabilizing existing retaining walls, getting the streets back into shape. And a lot of that effort looked at the long term. We didn't want to begin to make investments, major investments in things like brick sidewalks again until we had a better sense of the direction that we wanted to go. So a lot of that work was being held off until this planning effort started. So that was really one of the prime work efforts for the Department of Planning and Zoning for this last year. Late this winter, we began to look for a consultant to help us with that effort. We pretty much ended up with a national search doing that, and we were lucky enough to find a great firm right here in our own backyard. Mahan Reichel. Mahan Reichel was the perfect team, we thought. It involves not just Mahan Reichel, but they also have RK&K, an engineering firm also based in Baltimore, Arnett Muldrow. They are a Carolina firm, Land Studies, South Coast Consulting, and Preservation Consulting. And so, again, we were lucky enough to find a team like that just locally here, and Tom McGilloway is going to help introduce that team. I've known Tom for, I think Tom said that he's been in Howard County for 34 years or in the area. I've known Tom probably for 33 of those years. He's an excellent designer, urban designer, landscape architect, and he'll talk a little bit about his firm, Mahan Reichel. Again, their specialty is smaller communities like Ellicott City, communities that have been impacted by some sort of a disaster. And in this case, they've got a lot of similar experience working with flood-impacted communities in the Northeast as well as in the Gulf Coast. So I'll let Tom introduce the team members. Tom?
Great, thank you, Val. And good evening. This is a real pleasure for us to be involved in this. As I moved to Maryland 34 years ago, I landed in Ellicott City and lived here for 2 years, so it has a special place in my heart, and it's a very important community, so it's an honor to be working on this effort. So we're kicking off the master plan effort tonight. I'd like to start with introducing our team. And so what you have in the blue circles, that's our core team, Mahan Reichel out of Baltimore, that's our firm, RK&K in Baltimore, and then also Arnett Muldrow Associates in Greenville, South Carolina. Arnett Muldrow specializes in economic development, community branding, market. They probably worked in 300 Main Street communities. We've worked with them on about 50 of those, again, specializing in small and medium-sized communities. Supplementing our team, we have Land Studies out of Lidditz, Pennsylvania. Kelly Getschall is here from Land Studies. They focus on watershed planning and have done some very innovative work in floodplain restoration and dealing with flood-impacted communities. RK&K, we have John DePagne and Matt Thomason here representing us. There will be both Land Studies and RK&K will be taking some of the information that you hear tonight that was developed by McCormick Taylor on the hydrology and hydraulic study and helping advise the design team on how that can really inform some of the master plan decisions. We also have Lisa Wingate of Preservation Consulting, who's very familiar with Ellicott City, lives here, and we're really lucky to have her advising us to make sure we're really preserving the historic authenticity of the community. And then South Coast Consulting out of Baton Rouge and Gulfport, Mississippi. They're a team member that bring a lot of Main Street experience. Also, we worked with them in Arnett Muldrow in both the Mississippi Gulf Coast after Hurricane Katrina and in Vermont after the tropical storm Irene impacted 8 communities there. And then, of course, we'll be really lucky to be working with Steve and his group at Public Engagement Associates, who will continue to facilitate this process. So our, and then I forgot to mention my own team members here, Megan Griffith and Jeff Doobie from Mahan Reichel, who will be working on this effort along with the rest of our staff. So just wanted to give a quick overview of some of our experience. We recently, and I have the team members that were involved in the efforts at the bottom of the slide, but we recently completed a year-long economic development strategic plan for Lancaster, Pennsylvania, the city of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. A lot of people know the Dutch country, but this is the city. And really, we covered a broad range of economic analysis, physical improvements, planning, as well as community branding. An important thing to take away on this effort was that we not only focused on the downtown, but a very important part was the neighborhoods and the districts adjacent to the downtown and how they related. And that's, we know from the ULI study for Ellicott City that looking at different districts, we know we have different districts and neighborhoods of Ellicott City, so that's going to be very important as we do that effort here. Similarly, in State College, a downtown master plan, another year-long study, but looking at a broad range of integrated disciplines disciplines from engineering to urban design and planning, to development and economic development, but also looking at how different districts and the neighborhoods and the whole community ties into their downtown. We worked with RK&K more locally here with the revitalization of Main Street Annapolis, and really transformed the Main Street in that community probably, 20 years ago? 20 years ago. But our team, Arnett Muldrow Land Studies, and our whole team really brings some experience in flood-impacted communities. Arnett Muldrow, South Coast, and Mahan Reichel worked in about 8 communities along the Mississippi Gulf Coast after Katrina, and 8 communities in Vermont after Tropical Storm Irene, and really looking at integrated approach to those efforts. And each of those communities, through the master planning process, had an opportunity to really become stronger and better than what they were prior to those storms. And RK&K and Land Studies have extensive experience in Pennsylvania and Maryland in dealing with flood-impacted communities. Some examples of Land Studies work: watershed planning. As most of you know, the impacts downstream really can start to be, we could look at those opportunities upstream to how we can mitigate some of that, and you'll hear more about that tonight in Chris's presentation on the hydrology study. RK&K really developed the Carroll Creek in Frederick. If you've been there, this was about a 30-year in the making project. It is a flood mitigation project. Now, we don't really have the opportunity to do something this extensive in Ellicott City, but it's a great example of how dealing with a very functional, real problem with issue with infrastructure can turn into an amenity and be really respectful and of the character of the community and transform that. As I mentioned, Vermont, many of the communities in Vermont had a very similar structure or physical geography to Ellicott City, buildings built right adjacent to or over the tributaries feeding into the downtown, communities that really developed into districts. We developed wayfinding, branding, looked at how the opportunity can transform everyday places into better places, and place-making emphasis. Community branding, how each of these communities could better market themselves, use their existing imagery and branding to market themselves for new residents, businesses, and visitors. And then along the Gulf Coast of Mississippi, this was about over 10 years ago that we worked here, and this downtown has really transformed itself following Katrina with the master planning effort. As we talk about the master plan here in Ellicott City, our scope will be really dealing with an integrated approach. We're not just dealing with flood infrastructure, but we're looking at physical planning, urban design, parks, transportation, parking, community branding, funding strategies, and I want to emphasize implementation. All of the recommendations will be consolidated into an implementation action plan. All of this work will be informed by the hydrology and hydraulic study that we'll hear about tonight, as well as historic preservation. We know that's a very important aspect of Ellicott City. As you saw this diagram before, the blue is the flood, the watershed. So the targeted flood mitigation efforts will be focused within the watershed. However, other master plan aspects such as economic development and community branding really needs to take a broader look. We need to understand the relationship with Columbia and the surrounding communities, and then also Baltimore County and historic Catonsville will all play into informing the plan. So as we talk about this, I'd like to, if you could keep these 5 points in mind. I'm not going to read them here. I'll go through each one separately. But as we go through this, number one is that this effort is building upon efforts to date. I think one of the things that could be most frustrating to people is feeling like, well, haven't we gone through this effort before? You've all been through several public meetings over the past year. So we're going to be building on that information. We'll be building on the information that we hear tonight with the flood study, the work that was developed with the CAG and the Community Advisory Group, the flood work group, and this is just a sampling of the reports that we're in the process of absorbing, so that when we have discussions with you, it's building on that, not repeating it. Val had already mentioned that number two, this is an ongoing process. From August 2016 to May 2017, the focus has been on repair and getting the town up and running again. May of this year to spring of next year. The focus is on launching and completing this master plan effort and starting to identify and prioritize improvements that can be implemented. And then also summer 2018 and beyond is ongoing implementation. And the master plan will highlight a balance of short-term as well as long-term implementation efforts. Number 3 is that this is an opportunity to really make Ellicott City stronger and better than what it was before. But we had a great advisory team meeting prior to this meeting, and there's a lot of discussion about don't forget what makes us unique. We can't lose, in the process of making ourselves better, we can't lose what makes us so unique. And then from our team's experience in communities affected by disaster, effective disaster recovery is not returning to the status quo, but really taking the community to the next level. Example, Gulfport, Mississippi, since Katrina, they've seen $128 million in private investment. 83 facade improvements came out of the master plan effort, and 38 new business openings since 2007. And folks that live in Gulfport will tell you that prior to Katrina, downtown Gulfport and the surrounding districts were pretty dead. There wasn't a lot happening there. Today, it's transformed. It's a very vibrant downtown community, and all this effort came out of seizing this opportunity to make them better than what they were before. I mentioned implementation. This is a very important part of our planning process. All of the recommendations will be put into an implementation strategy. Again, we talked about Gulfport, but Vermont, Stephanie Francis of South Coast Consulting on our team wrote 8 grants for the 8 communities in Vermont. All of them were successful and then resulted in 6 facade improvements, 10 business openings, and 5 new communities, 5 new businesses in communities. So our plan is very focused on action-oriented items. The implementation, again, as I mentioned, balances the short and the long term, but the short-term focus on rebuilding with moderate investments, but also taking a longer-term focus that may have more significant investments as well. Number 5, we're developing a game plan, and we're going to need your help to continue to provide input. We have comment cards tonight to get input, but we'll have a series of meetings that I'll review with you shortly where there's opportunities and different touch points to provide input. We want to develop the best solutions to build resiliency, and we want to consider cost-effective, thoughtful, and effective solutions. So the H&H model that you'll be hearing about tonight is a very sophisticated tool, and it's going to be used to inform the master plan. It's not the game plan in itself, but we can use the information, use that model to inform the process to look at highlighting how we can highlight risk at a watershed-wide level and examine potential reductions in certain areas within the community. The model will allow us to test how improvements affect flooding. They might be improvements related to infrastructure, such as bridges, stream crossings, culverts, or retaining walls, but also improvements to flood storage areas, such as stormwater management, underground retention, and so forth. We'll run different scenarios will be run through the model to explore the improvements that will be most effective in reducing flood surface elevation. And these scenarios may include increasing pipe sizes, culvert sizes, adding stream crossing capacity, and so forth. And you'll hear more about that from Chris later on tonight. The schedule, this is pretty much May 2017 to May 2018. So I won't get into all the exhaustive detail on this, but the squiggly line at the bottom represents that this is a building on input from you all, and there'll be various touch points where we'll be getting input from you so that our recommendations are informed by the community and not just a bunch of consultants. Each of the boxes with the numbers in represent major touch points that we'll be meeting with stakeholders and our technical team, our client group, and the advisory team. The important thing for you to remember, though, is that the highlighted in orange are the different public touch points. So we'll have the week of July 10th will be our next workshop. Our whole team will be here over the course of 3 days. We'll have a potential pop-up event in September, possibly tied in with the Music Fest. So it'll be something that's a little more fun that you can engage in and get updates on the master plan. The week of November 13th, we'll be sharing scenarios, potential alternatives, and solutions to get your input on. Come back in January to continue those discussions and look at refinements to those, and then look at a draft plan in the early week of March, and then finalize the plan in May. So those orange areas are the public touch points, and we'll be getting more information out to you of the specific dates and times. So next up is the July workshop, and it's going to occur over July 11th through the 13th. We're hoping the public meeting will be the evening of July 11th. That's still being determined. We have to finalize the location for that, but it will be likely the 11th or the 12th. During that time, we'll be meeting with the technical team, doing site assessment, meeting with the advisory team, meeting with business groups, focus groups, stakeholder groups, and getting a lot of information download, confirming what we've read and heard, and getting additional input. And meetings will take on a variety of formats, such as you see here. We'll have a large group. And then in September, potentially at the Music Fest, we'll have something that's a little more fun, a pop-up engagement. It will be an opportunity to hear more about the master plan process, and opportunity to provide some input. So with that, we'll have a couple minutes for some questions.
Right. So now there's an opportunity to ask questions, our first opportunity tonight. If you have questions, we're going to need you to come up to the microphone here to be able to ask them. So if you can start lining up now. And again, although we may not get many this first round, keeping your questions succinct will help us to keep on time and address as many questions that people have.
Hi. Did your study affect or have take into account upstream development?
Well, our study didn't start yet, so the master plan is just starting now. So we'll be looking at the entire watershed area, and you'll be hearing more in the H&H study tonight about development within the watershed.
Okay,
So.
thank you.
I'm sorry, can you also just quickly say your name just for the...
My name's Robin Holiday.
Great, thank you,
Thank
Robin.
you.
Hello, Dick Clinch, live in Miller's Grant. I liked what you said about improving the facades to make the place look better for investment. Overhead electrical distribution is a mess in Ellicott City, and we lived in Annapolis before moving here. We're there when Irene occurred, and they didn't fix it. When you're doing all this work underground, there's a possibility for you to go switch from overhead, which is to underground, which is very expensive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So those are things that we'll be looking at in this process. Yes. Thank you.
Other questions? Going once, going twice?
All right. Here's one.
Great.
I'd just like to say, Barrington Sweeney from West End, we have to have each house give their input. Most people in West End has been there 50 years. Kids we grew up as kids looking out the window at the water, and we need to be able to have you guys trust us on what we see and what our ideas are. Because I mean, you guys are good at what you do, but you don't live there, and you don't see the water, and you don't see how it reacts. And we definitely need to have our input heard. So whoever you guys that reach out to the community, because the last study we had, I think it was like 70% of the people were left off of the study. That little study they had of people's damages and eye accounts. Nobody talked to me. Mm-hmm. And my mother and her family's been in that community since 1920. I've been there myself 56 years. Live right on the water. I could reach out and touch the water from in my mother's house. And nobody came to our house and asked any questions.
Yeah. And that was one of the things that we learned in Lancaster, is reaching out to those districts adjacent to the downtown was very important for informing the plan. So we'll have, I know there's some comment cards tonight, but one of the things what I liked about what you said is you raised a hope for this process of what we would include. So, others, as you fill out the comment cards, include what you would hope this process includes, or opportunities to share input.
Let me just say, talking about it is a lot easier than putting it down on paper. Mm-hmm. Call us each up individually to wherever you're going to have a meeting at, so we can give it to you. I mean, I know you don't want us to waste your time and everything, but I have some good ideas. that would help keep West End, the upper part of West End, dry. And, you know, how do I get them out there? Keep spreading it around to people and maybe it gets to the right person? I mean, I'd like to talk directly to somebody.
We'd love to hear them. And there's a organized group of residents for West End right now. Is that, are you a part of that group?
No, I'm not
or
going to be a part of it, but I am going to be at the next meeting
Okay.
and at least be in the audience.
Great,
anyway, so.
and we strongly encourage you to invite your neighbors to come, and we'll look at the ability to reach out to people
Okay.
on a more individual basis. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Yes, young man.
My name is Nico Drummond, and I was wondering how you're going to get, kind of like he just said, how you're going to get different representation from all ages, young, old, and everywhere in between.
That's a great comment because we love to get, we really like to have a broad representation. So we don't have all the details of the July workshop other than the dates set up, but we're going to identify different times of those days and the evenings that we can meet with different groups. And we want to meet with the youth in the communities, different interest groups. It might be the faith community, some of the education communities. So we'll have a series of different times that we could be meeting with different groups and folks. So
Okay, thank you.
Will you be able to help us bring out young people?
Sure.
yeah,
to some of
we
that?
need
That'd
you
be
to
great.
spread the word to get more involved. So that would be great.
That would
Cool.
be fantastic.
Thank
All right.
you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm
Hi.
John Bolton. Looking here at the study, it says that you're going to replicate the July 30th, 2016 storm and look at the 100-year storms. Would there be a scenario analysis that considers other storms that are beyond the 100-year
So
threshold?
if you could hold that question, because we have
That's
Chris
for the next part of
from
it.
McCormick and Taylor that will be giving a pretty extensive presentation on the hydrology and hydraulic study and the model that they've built and the various time scenarios and so on and so forth. If that doesn't answer your question, I would strongly encourage you to come back up and make sure that you get it answered. But you're in front of Chris's presentation. Please come back when he's done and let us know if you've
Cool. Thank you.
gotten it answered. Thank you.
My name is William Bishop, and before you all get off the subject of the overhead electrical and utility lines, that has been discussed at a previous time. And BGE at one time was going to come out and do that or did a survey, but it was determined that it would all have to be brought in from the rear of the buildings. It would be up to the owner of the property to pay for that. And the expense was astronomical, so that's where it went.
Okay, yeah, and we are looking at all the history of some of those discussions as well. So thank you.
Any other burning questions? Mike's still live over here. All right, if we can give a round
Thank
of
you.
applause to Tom and his team. So now I'd like to bring up Mark DeLuca, who is the Deputy Director of the Department of Public Works. And he's going to introduce what you need to know about the H&H study.
Thanks, Steve. I'll just repeat, I'm Mark DeLuca. I'm Deputy Director of Public Works and the Chief of Environmental Services, of which the Stormwater Group is a part of. And we worked most closely with McCormick Taylor in developing the study and coordinating the information that they needed to perform the study. And what I wanted to do very quickly was just to take a step back before I introduce McCormick Taylor and just mention that starting in 2015, the executive created the flood work group, who a lot of the members are here tonight, and also provided the funding for us to start repairing the walls, repairing the storm channel, the stream channel. And of course then in July of 2016, the flood happened, and we brought McCormick Taylor back in to perform this H&H study. And the reason why I say brought them back in was because they had done an H&H study after Tropical Storm Lee. But this time, what we wanted them to do was we wanted a much more comprehensive study. We wanted them to look at the entire watershed. We wanted them to look at all the streams, not just the Hudson, but the Tiber and the New Cut, and with the purpose of creating this model, this hydrologic model that would show how the streams reacted during any given storm. And so we plugged in the July 30th storm, we plugged in some other type of storm events to see how the streams would react. And hopefully out of that process, we would come up with the best solutions to how to manage or control that stormwater. So what you see behind me right now are some of the pictures of some of the projects that we move forward with until actually restoring a lot of the stream walls, and some of them are also flood mitigation projects. And I just want to point to this agenda that I hope everyone picked up, and on the second page starts a list of about 30 active projects that we're currently doing right now. So I only point that out because I don't want you to leave tonight thinking that we really haven't started to do anything and we're waiting for this H&H study to really put it in gear. Some of the work has already started, and some of these slides will show some of the restoration work that we've already undertaken. So without any further delay in me standing in front of Chris Brooks from McCormick Taylor will present the H&H study.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, so there's a lot to cover tonight, so I'm going to jump right into things. So we're going to start talking about a little bit of background just to help everybody understand sort of how we approach the study and some of the basic technical terms associated with determining the hydrology and then the hydraulic model as well. We'll talk a little bit about the existing conditions and what the model told us about the July 30th storm event and how things are today. Then we'll have a little Q&A at that point. And then the second part of the presentation will include talking about the improvements to address the problem of flood frequency in Ellicott City, and then where we go from there. So let me just start off by talking about what the model does. In the most basic sense, it determines the quantity of water that passes through the town, through the Hudson Branch and the other tributaries that come in. Now we've done this from US 29 along the Hudson Branch as it winds in and out of Main Street, down to where it outlets into the Patapsco River. So it's covering that whole area. It's much more extensive than the earlier study that Mark had mentioned. Now this model can tell us the quantity of water, that's the hydrology part. It can tell us the depth of the water for various storms, and that's the hydraulics part. It can also tell us things about the velocity of the water and the destructive force of the water, which is going to be helpful in the planning effort as well. So, as I said, we looked at the July 30th event, recreated that as part of the model, and then also looked at some standard storm events to use as benchmarks for the improvement, including the 100-year storm. So I want to talk a little bit about the 100-year storm because that can be a confusing term. 100-year storm basically means that that storm event has a 1% chance, a 1 in 100 chance of happening in any given year. So similarly, a 10-year storm would have a 1 in 10 chance or a 10% chance. 25 is a 4% chance, and so on. So these are standard storm events and standard probabilities that we use as benchmarks. Of course, any real-life storm event isn't going to follow this exactly, but it allows us to compare apples to apples as we look at improvements. And again, it's certainly noteworthy that a 100-year storm can happen more frequently than once every 100 years. Just as if you put a number down on the roulette table, it's got a 3% chance of coming up. That doesn't mean it can't come up twice in a row. So keep that in mind as we talk about and use that term 100-year storm. So here in Ellicott City, in the Watershed, the 1% storm represents about 8.5 inches in 24 hours. Now, the storm event that we had on July 30th, that wasn't quite 8.5 inches, but it came a lot more quickly, so it was more intense, and we'll look at that a little bit too. So another term you're going to hear tonight is hydrograph. What is a hydrograph? Now, the graphic that you see on here is actually a representation of that July 30th storm event. And the shape of the curve demonstrates the peak flow as it occurred over time. So that this actual curve represents the peak flow going through the lower end of Main Street during the storm. And now the shape of that curve tells you something about the flow intensity. Basically, the steeper the curve goes up, the more intense the rise of the water is happening, and things are happening very quickly as they did that night. So the peak flow, which is represented at the top of the curve, that's typically given in cubic feet per second. That's the unit of measure that we use in this industry. Another thing about this hydrograph, what it can tell us, is if you mathematically calculated the area under that curve, it's going to tell us the total volume of water associated with that storm event. Now, in this case, that number is almost 35 million cubic feet. And since that's a pretty big number to get a handle around, we usually use a unit called acre feet. Now, in the case of the storm event, it was close to 800 acre feet of water that came through downtown Ellicott City that night. So let's talk about acre feet, because I know that can be a concept it's a little hard to wrap your head around how big that might be. So it represents essentially 1 foot of water over a 1 acre area, which is a little over 43,000 square feet. To give you some local perspective on that, parking lot F, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, this is located behind the wine bin. This has a footprint of approximately 1 acre in size. So if you visualize a foot of water sitting on top of that parking lot, that is 1 acre foot of water. Now, as a point of comparison, if you built a skyscraper on top of this parking lot in the same footprint, it would need to be 80 stories high to contain the water that came through Ellicott City on July 30th. So that's kind of what we're dealing with when we talk about these type of storm events. So why does Ellicott City flood? It's a very basic question. Now, we all know that watershed development plays a role. And the more impervious area there is in a watershed, the faster and larger quantity of water will flow off into the streams and rivers. But that's not the whole story, and this is important to remember. Ellicott City, as a town, is built on top of the floodplain of Hudson Branch. So to show you in a natural, undeveloped floodplain scenario, you can see here, you've got sort of the 1 or 2 inches is going to stay in the channel, and then when it gets above that, it's got a place to spread out naturally, so it never gets terribly deep. It's got floodplain access, as we like to say. Now, when that same channel gets sort of confined in a narrow channel like that, and development occurs and fill occurs, that same amount of water then comes up the channel very quickly and spills out over the banks. So when you kind of look at these two scenarios, one on top of each other, that's the same amount of water, but when that floodplain is then filled in and built upon, the water pushes out and gets out there very quickly. So that's kind of what we're up against in terms of trying to address the problem of flooding in Ellicott City. So we'll talk a little bit about the model. It's a two-dimensional hydraulic model. As said before, it extends from US 29 all the way down to the Patapsco River. The area that you see in red up here represents the coverage of the model, the channel and the floodplains, and basically the areas where the water gets out and floods when Hudson Branch overtops. So this includes also the confluences where the New Cut and Tiber rivers come in. The Tiber comes in here at parking lot D, and then the New Cut comes in down here along New Cut Road. And then, of course, all of it combined carries through that last stretch along the south side of Main Street. So the entire watershed, a few statistics all throughout there for everyone's information. It's a little under 4 square miles. The New Cut and the Hudson make up the majority of that, Hudson being on top here, the New Cut in yellow below. The Tiber branch is in the middle, just to the south of Main Street, and that's the last half square mile or so. So as part of this model, we looked at 9 separate inflow points along Main Street as far as putting water into that hydraulic model to show how the flooding evolved throughout the town. Now, it's important to note, too, that the model does consider the effect of the existing stormwater management in the watershed. So there are currently 64 ponds that are categorized by the county within this watershed as stormwater management ponds, and those were considered. And another thing we looked at for hydrology is what we'll call the undeveloped condition. This is the condition where Main Street exists, but everything else in the watershed is woods. There's no development. And we wanted to do that as a point of comparison that we'll talk about a little bit later. Now, we looked at multiple storm scenarios. Again, the 100-year is kind of our baseline that we're using. We also examined the 10-year and you're going to hear about why in a little bit. Now, we actually examined many other storm events in addition to those, which was a question that came from a gentleman earlier, but we didn't want to overwhelm with information with 18 different scenarios here, so we're going to really focus on these two events as well as the July 30th event tonight. So we used the storm data from that event to synthesize it, which allowed us to check the model. So we took the National Weather Service rainfall data and put that into the hydrology model. And we also had USGS, the Geological Survey, did some measurements in the channels to determine how much water was flowing in each of the sub-watersheds that night. And we were able to use those numbers and kind of back calculate in our model to see how close we came. So that served as a good check for our model. And then we also used the reports from citizens like yourself as well as the YouTube videos. And this allowed us to calibrate the hydraulic model and look at the depth in the model compared to the depth of the water that occurred that night. Now, I'm not going to tell you that everything about it is exactly correct. Within hydrology, it's generally considered a relative error of 30% or so. So if the model shows there was 5 feet of water in front of your house and it was actually 3.5 or 5.5, that might be the case. But the important thing is we wanted to get something that was in that recognizable error so that we could use that as a benchmark, comparing apples to apples for the improvements we're going to talk about tonight. So here we are back to the hydrograph. So that purple curve on top, that represents the 730 event. That was the really steep event. The green is the 100-year. That's our standard storm. And the blue is the 10-year. Now, that 10-year is something that we're going to sort of aspire to. Now, these are the peak flows associated. You can see the highest peak flow came in the July 30th event. It was over 8,000 cubic feet per second going into the Patapsco at the peak of the storm. The 100-year is actually about 7,800, so it's actually lower than that. Now, the volume of water is another thing that we look at because storing that volume is what really leads to the management. Storing it and letting it out slowly is what allows us to reduce these peaks. The interesting thing to note, the 100-year volume is actually higher than the 730 volume, and that's just because the 730 occurred over a short period of time. The 100-year stretches out over a 24-hour storm. And then the 10-year, again, is point of comparison, and we will sort of get to that in a little bit. So with all that in mind, this very colorful graphic that you see up here represents the hydraulic model of that 730 storm event at its peak. So you can see where the channel exists. The purple represents an 8-foot or more depth. By and large, that occurs only in the channel, although when you get down to the lower part of Main Street, where we looked at some of the YouTube videos, we actually were touching the awnings in front of the shops with the surface of the water. I think it's very intense. The red is 4 to 6, and darker red is 6 to 8. So one of the things you can look at this is it really kind of highlights where some of the most severe flooding problems occurred. Certainly down here by the west end. Another area here where the water has to get through the culvert in the channel, and then through the parking lots, and of course lower Main Street as well. Now, another thing this model can do, as I said before, it can tell us about the velocity, how fast the water is traveling. And this is particularly important when we're looking at the durability of infrastructure during the flood. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. As many of you might remember during that event, when you get down in the vicinity of Church Road, this is where the roadway scoured out quite deep, back down to the foundation level of the adjacent businesses. And it correlates well with the higher velocities. The model is showing us in excess of 12 feet per second. And then also similarly down at the end of Main Street where additional scour occurred. Now this graphic on the left represents what we call shear force. That's basically the destructive force. That's what the velocity does that can pull and tear things apart. And again, you can see those areas that suffered the worst roadway damage are 10 plus pounds per square foot. Certainly the areas also here where the new cut came in and the water actually broke through the back of the buildings and out into Main Street, where a lot of that destruction occurred, is consistent. So I won't delve too much into this tonight, but want to just for people to see what the model can do and some of the different things some of the different tools that are available to us in helping in designing flood-resilient infrastructure going forward. So much like the 730 storm, this is the 100-year storm. It looks similar in terms of the areas that are most problematic. The depths are a little bit lower. I show this because this is going to be the benchmark for comparison as we go forward in talking about some of the concepts. So with that, kind of thrown a lot of stuff out there to start. Want to give some opportunity if anybody has any questions about that part of the presentation so far.
Can you just say a word about what the second part of the presentation will cover? So
Sure. So after this, we're going to talk about the modeling of some of the conceptual improvements and how they will affect the frequency and depth of flooding in Ellicott City.
great. So the floor is open for questions. If you have any, please, we'll follow the same process as before.
Quick question.
If you could say your name.
Dan. Hey, guys. Quick question about the 100-year storm baseline.
Mhm.
That's 8.5 inches in a 24-hour period.
That's correct.
We had 6.5 inches in 2 hours.
That's correct.
Is there going to be any consideration when you're making these models that this wasn't a 100-year storm, this is more of a 1,000-year storm?
Well, that's why we included the synthesized 730 storm as part of that. And we're going to see some examples of how the suggested improvements would compare that storm event to, as it occurred to under the improved condition. The way the model works, we can model any storm event. It's sort of infinite in terms of how many different iterations you can do. And as we go forward, the tool can be used in that way to examine different scenarios.
And is the idea that we're trying to control the 100-year storm with all of the improvements, or is it?
The 100-year storm, it serves as a benchmark.
Yeah.
I mean, it's important to note that everything we do is going to have incremental improvement, and it will improve the 25-year storm this much, the 100-year storm this much. It really just serves because it's kind of a standard. And when you hear about the FEMA 100-year floodplain, for example, it's sort of a standard in the industry. It allows us a benchmark to use, but it really could be. We could arbitrarily do that with any benchmark if we chose to. It's just we picked that one because of its sort of standard use in the industry.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Yep.
Great, thank you.
Hello, my name is Adam. I'm assuming that your study was done based on the buildings and houses that are currently here. Does that change with future building?
It was done on the existing conditions. We did look at, in terms of the watershed, we looked at ultimate development based on zoning. It was slightly different, but not dramatically different in terms of the hydrology and how much water came off. But our model, and one thing our model can do, if there was a change in infrastructure, if a building was removed, if a stream crossing was expanded, we can plug that in the model and see what the effect is. So.
Okay, I think you're going to hear more about this later. Thank you.
Yep.
Hi, my name is Melissa Metz. My question is, in modeling the July 30th storm, you said that you relied also on accounts of the flood. I assume that that's through the case study. To what extent did you rely on the case study? Because there is some information that wasn't included in the case study, and as Barrington mentioned earlier, it would be quite useful to actually have more conversations with people who live in that area. So I'd like to know, what impact does omitting some of that information have on the on your model?
So what we did, we took the folks who prepared that study provided us with charts that had property by property. This is the flood depth that was reported. So we used that as a spot check when we ran through our model to see how that compared. If we saw a dramatic difference, if somebody said we got 6 feet of water and our model showed 2, for example, we knew that we would have to adjust the parameters of the model to get it closer to what actually happened. So we tried to do that as much as possible in spot checks throughout the model.
Is there an opportunity to collect more first-hand accounts to continue to spot check that model?
There's always an opportunity for more data. The more data you have, the better your models get. So absolutely.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hi, my name is Edri Ortega. I was wondering if you are able to show animated data studies instead of static images for the next presentation.
In terms of the flood model?
Right.
I guess to start off, we do have the ability to do that. Within the presentation we're going to show you tonight, we're going to toggle between different scenarios, which will provide an ad hoc animated view, so to speak, so that you can see how sort of the colors representing the depths change between the different situations.
Okay.
Now, for what it's worth, the model also is capable of showing the depth changes through the storm. So, for example, in the 730 event, we could show how the depth went up and down through the time frame But again, in the interest of not overwhelming with data tonight, we sort of focused on a few.
I think that's what we're here for, though. You know, it's like we want everything.
Be careful what you wish for.
Another question is, I think the boundary of where the data is showing should be a little expanded. I know we're in a huge, we're almost like in a valley and kind of in a cove. I think it'd be interesting to see the boundary of the data at the peaks of the mountains that surround it, because, I mean, you know, flooding is always changing, and I think it'd be a little more helpful to see in time where things are failing at a certain point, et cetera, et cetera. That's just a comment. And then my last comment would be, just like recycling, I think we're kind of part of a movement right now, and if the community can kind of change the way of living in these flood environments, just like recycling, is there something that you guys can perceive as professionals for the community to start acting upon how we actually live in these areas?
It's a very broad question. Right?
I just wanted to put that out there. But I think it's very interesting, so thank you for putting this together. But I think this is a start of something that could be really big and could be placed and implemented in a lot of places that we all feel really close to.
I think in a general sense, to answer your question, I mean, anything that can be done to reduce runoff is a positive for the watershed.
Right.
We will talk a little bit, though, about how the size of the problem is such that it requires not only that, but much bigger, broad strokes in order to really do what we need to do.
Great, thank you.
And there may, I think, may be an opportunity to talk about some of those ideas during the master plan process.
Okay.
So.
Hi, my name is Beth. I appreciate you being open to gathering more data points, and I was just looking for a technical response on where and how we should report that information to you.
I would say I will defer to the county as far as the actual points of contact.
Who's going to give their email address?
So.
Hi, my name is.
No, we're serious. Phil, how are we going to report it? So I can give it to everybody? You can give it to everybody. All right.
Phil's going to have a lot of late nights, I think. Thank you, Phil.
My name's Denise Cordes, and I have a question about the models.
Mm-hmm.
So you did an H&H study to some extent after the 2011 flood.
That's
right?
correct.
Did you do the extent of illustrations similar to what we just saw with purple, yellow, red?
Yes.
Were you able to see any differences in flow and depth from 2011 to 2016?
Things did vary slightly. Anytime you get a separate survey and the data is a little bit different, there were slight variations. Without getting into too much technical detail, since that study was done, some of the so-called rules of hydrology, in terms of how the SCS has determined what the runoff coefficients would be, have changed. So we had to recalculate that. So there is a little bit of apples and oranges going on between that study and the new study. But the new study is based on the most current data. The precipitation data has also changed since then.
Our history has changed, yeah. And the reason I ask that is because there are a lot of people affected by this who perceive that upstream watershed development has contributed to the increase in the flooding comparing 2011 to 2016. And I think that may be helpful to show us illustratively of what you think or what you got in 2011, what you have compares to 2016, and then is there some projection potential with the planned upstream development that's slated to occur in the next few years?
There are, the ultimate development conditions, one thing we look at, which is sort of considering the extent to which the watershed can be developed. It's quite developed right now. There aren't a lot of undeveloped areas, but
there's still a lot of slated development right in the periphery.
And that is part of the overall study, yes.
So we'll see models of that when you call it the ultimate model.
Condition.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Nora. I just had a quick question. Does your model take into account that the storm 2015 to 2016 was actually an El Nino year, which would impact the precipitation levels? So would your model include stuff like El Nino and La Nina? Take a look at that.
We typically don't look at it on a climatic basis. Generally speaking, when we talk about the 100-year storm, it's based on a certain rainfall event. which could occur under different climatic conditions. I mean, even when we have a low precipitation year, you can still get that aberration of a large tropical event or a small thunderstorm outbreak. So we don't go that macro with it.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Hello, my name's Jean Sedlacko. Following up on the question just before hers, if you have development just to the west of the outlined area, I know you're measuring the water in that outline. Are you considering the development outside that outline?
The development outside that outline will affect somebody, but it won't affect Hudson Branch, Ellicott City. It'll flow in the opposite direction, and somebody will be affected by it. But if it's outside of the boundary that we showed, that means that the rainfall ultimately doesn't enter Hudson Tiber.
But that's in the watershed.
It's within the watershed, the larger watershed of the Patapsco, but not within the watershed of the Hudson Tiber that flows through. So what the boundary represents is sort of if a raindrop falls on this side, it's eventually going to make its way through Main Street, Ellicott City. If it falls on this side, it's going to go away from Main Street, Ellicott City, and impact somebody in some other stream, but not Ellicott City. So it's sort of that divide. It represents that dividing line of which way the water will go.
Okay, it's just, I'm not trying to be argumentative. It's just interesting because the development I'm talking about is uphill. West of 29, it's uphill.
Well, there are some areas west of 29 included. They're included in the hydrology to the study.
Okay.
We stopped the flow model, the hydraulic
Okay,
model.
that's, I guess, what I'm trying to
Okay. Sorry, I misunderstood.
Yeah.
Yeah, there definitely are areas west of 29, significant areas that contribute.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
Sure.
Great. So why don't we wrap up the Q&A and go to part 2, Chris?
Okay, so I want to start off by saying that some of the conceptual improvements you're going to hear about now reflect the input that we received, particularly through the CAG, and a lot of the ideas that people represented that they thought would be of value in addressing the flooding. In the stormwater management side, the managing of the volume, that included large online stormwater ponds, which typically aren't done in the 21st century, but can be done in special cases. Represents underground management, utilizing underground in areas where there's a lot of development. We don't have room for large ponds. We also took a look at the existing stormwater ponds and how much the expansion of those existing ponds would benefit. That's another question that came to us frequently. Now, in addition to the management of the water and the storage, there's also the capacity to consider, and that's basically how big the infrastructure is to carry this water through Ellicott City. So we looked at additional culverts, particularly in the west end where we know that more culverts are needed. We looked at supplemental culverts wherever the stream crosses back and forth across Main Street, Frederick Road, which it does several times. We also looked at some larger scale conveyance measures for Lower Main Street. So all of these are going to be represented in the next few slides. And one thing I want to warn everybody, these are concepts, and they represent conceptually what can be achieved with these improvements. They don't represent projects that are going to be coming to your property next month. So if you see something near your house and it makes you nervous, please don't fret, because the devil is in the details, and the details are all still to come. These are very conceptual and broad brush improvements we're talking about today. So back to our old friend, the hydrograph. This is, again, the 10 and 100-year comparison. And the reason for showing that, how we talked about the area under the curve represents the volume. So we look at the difference between the 100-year and the 10-year storm. And the volume of that is over 600 acre-feet. So one of our goals is to try to take as much of that volume as possible and store it and meter it out slowly so that we can reduce the peak. So quantifying that was the first step. So again, this was our 100-year existing model, our benchmark model. And this is the 10-year model. Now, one thing you're going to look at is, well, you're only reducing the 10. I still see flooding in the 10. And again, that's true, because again, we're still dealing with that situation where we're lacking a floodplain, and where just managing back to that point alone is not going to make flooding go away. But it is also a dramatic improvement. If you look, I toggle back and forth here a little bit, you can see some of the areas of red, 4 to 6 feet, going down to 1 to 2 feet. Some of the areas in purple representing 8 feet, now going down to 4 to 5 feet. So Again, knowing that we can't store every raindrop that falls in the watershed, the 10-year represented a good target to start with for reducing that 100-year flow. And it does, as you can see through here, again, focus on the parking lots, some of the other areas, a fairly dramatic difference before and after. So we're going to talk first about above ground ponds, and then we're going to talk about underground storage. So looking at the above ground ponds, and there's 11 ponds that we're going to talk about here that represent almost 300 acre feet of storage. And what you could see is the implementation of those gets us from the 100-year more than halfway down to the 10-year in terms of reducing that peak. So that's really a big movement there. When we bring the underground storage into it, we get over 400 acre feet of storage. That gets our 100-year peak all the way down to a 10-year peak. And that is really a significant change in the quantity of water that would occur in an 8.5-inch rainstorm. So now this is an overview of the watershed, and many of these shapes represent the ponds that we're talking about, as well as the underground structures. So you can see there are several along Hudson Branch, although not so much in the developed area where we needed to go underground because of all the buildings and businesses there. There's one very large in the Tiber, and there's 3 in line in the Autumn Hill branch of the New Cut, and then one more in the New Cut in the southeast corner. I'm going to zoom in on these a little bit in the next few slides. So this first pond, again, in the Tiber, this is our largest one, 70 acre feet. It was a good location because it's in an existing floodplain that's not developed in between Main Street and Old Columbia Pike. Again, 4 facilities in the New Cut. You can see 3 of them are kind of in a line here with this upstream one, the largest. And then that 4th one is kind of tucked down in the southeast corner. And these combined represent 153 acre feet of storage, conceptually. Now within the Hudson, the ponds had to be a little smaller because there's more going on, so we needed more of them. You can see there's 3 ponds in the US 29, US 40 interchange, which is currently state highway property. And then there are 3 others as the stream winds back and forth under Main Street, Frederick Road. So we really looked for every opportunity that we could to store this water, because the more we store, the more we reduce that peak. But it was definitely challenging with all the existing development there. So with that in mind, looking at the Hudson watershed, we had to go underground. And again, some of these areas came, again, in the feedback from the CAG and from the community. First area is in the old Roger Carter Center here on Ellicott Mills Drive, where by creating what we call a pipe farm, essentially a row of large pipes to store the water underground, we could put in almost a mile of 10-foot diameter pipe and store over 8 acre feet of water. And the good thing about underground, you bury that, you can develop the space on top for recreational use. It's kind of a win-win there. Now, another thing that came to us in some of the feedback was, can we use that area that BGE uses for their power lines along 29? Well, I don't expect they're going to be thrilled about that, but at the same time, is it feasible? Is it worth looking at? Absolutely. When we took a look at it, we looked at over 30 acre feet of storage available if we could utilize that area, representing over 3 miles of large storage pipes. So, together, this is 40 acre feet of additional storage we can get by going underground. And because we really wanted to maximize everything we could do, we continued to look and looked at the option of underground vaults. And these would basically be, if you picture just a really big foundation, a really big basement that would fill up with water and then be pumped out subsequent to the storm. So the first location would be under Lot F, which was our 1 acre represented area there. Again, keep in mind, these are conceptual. And the second spot we looked at was in the West End service area there. And that was because of the location relative to the stream. It made for a good area, but obviously there are challenges with the existing property associated with putting that in. And again, very conceptual at this point. A third area as well, looking at the 8700 block of Main Street, Frederick Road, and some of the areas which are undeveloped or don't have houses on them, where you could go underground, fill back in, have a nice grass area on top if you like. It's not even there, more or less. So total volume of all 18 sites above and below ground represents 428 acre feet of storage. When that water is stored and metered out slowly, we're taking that away from the peak. That's what's really going to be a big part of reducing flood elevations as it goes through downtown. Now, as I alluded to earlier, we get a number of questions about, well, can we just make our existing ponds bigger? So right now we've got about 64 ponds. We have 64 ponds that represent about 86 acre-feet of storage, which is a big number, but it's not a huge number like we're talking about tonight. If we assumed each of those ponds on average, we could make about 25% bigger given the restrictions with existing buildings, zoning property. That gets us 22 acre-feet. So when you look at that number, and you say for 64 individual projects, it's going to get us about 5% of those 18 projects. It's kind of a good representation of why we need to go big in addressing this problem. And even looking at those individual 18 sites, you can see that a lot of the individual sites represent a larger total than retrofitting all 64 ponds in the watershed. So I should note, any retrofit, any increase in storage, anything to improve stormwater management in the watershed, every bit of it is good. Every bit of it helps. But because of the volume of water we're trying to address here, we have to go with big brush strokes in order to really get somewhere. So talking a little bit about the other half of the equation, which is the conveyance, which is moving what water does come through down through Ellicott City. So we looked at a number of areas where the stream crosses back and forth and putting in additional culverts. So you can see there's one here, 8800 Frederick Road, the crossing under Papillon Drive. And there's another crossing here around 8777 Frederick Road. And then lastly, the water, handling the water coming down Rogers Ave into the channel is another area where you see that had some flooding that could be improved. So these are relatively straightforward compared to these large ponds we talked about, relatively straightforward approaches to improve conveyance. These cross culverts are going to improve flooding at the immediate location, but it keeps the water off of Main Street with more frequency, or less frequency of flooding. Now, looking at the West End area, which we also knew to be sort of a bottleneck, there is an existing culvert right now that runs through here that could be made bigger. And then in addition to that, running an additional culvert, which would then carry the water under Main Street, past this set of houses, and now fall into a place where the channel is much deeper. We can make some significant improvement in flooding with that. There's also this area where the stream comes between the structures and goes under a culvert. We saw an opportunity to look at a bypass culvert there that would further improve, along with the addition of a flood berm, which would essentially serve to keep that water away from the houses there. So this is, again, the devil's in the details, but conceptually, we can see some significant improvement through this area with these additional pipes and the berm. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and go back to earlier on. We talked about what would happen if there was no development in the watershed, if the rest of the watershed was woods and Main Street was the only thing that existed. Well, for one thing, the peak flows go down a lot. They go down almost half, and that's not surprising because development makes a big difference in the amount of runoff you get. But what we found is that even if you took away every bit of development in the watershed, the road still floods. It's still significant. And again, it comes back to that lack of natural conveyance, that lack of a floodplain. We're still up against that challenge. And it's again why we have to go above and beyond the normal improvements over the developed condition. We have to store even more water than we normally would if we're really going to tackle addressing flood reduction. The development and the runoff associated with it matters, but it's not going to get us the whole way there. So again, back to our 100-year benchmark here. This is the undeveloped condition. So this is, the watershed had no development. We ran it through Main Street as it exists today. Now you can see it's notably lower. You got purple to red. You've got a lot of red going to mostly orange. So you've got 6 to 8 going to 4 to 6. You got a couple feet reduction, but you still have significant flooding there. Now going ahead to this next slide. This slide represents the management with just the above ground ponds and no underground. And what you'll see, it's actually very close to that undeveloped condition. So that 228 acre feet of storage is roughly equivalent to if the entire watershed had the development removed in terms of its impact on flooding. So again, existing, undeveloped, and then our 11 above ground ponds right there. Now, if we go a little further and we add the underground facilities, you can see things improve even more. And again, I want to note out in the West End here, 4 to 6 feet, you're going down to 1 to 2, a little over 2. The parking lot areas through here near the brewery, again, you get that underground management. You can really see the extent of the flooding going away because there's a lot of storage associated with that. And down Lower Main Street, where you're looking at 6 to 8, now you're going more in the 4 to 5 range there. So we're not all the way there yet, but you can see incrementally how adding each step of this creates a better condition. So when we take all of that stormwater management, throw it in with those conveyance improvements, those additional pipes, those additional cross culverts, and you're going to see further improvement, particularly in the west end. If you notice through here, we add that additional pipe. Again, this is the 100-year existing, and this is with all the stormwater and conveyance we talked about. Really, there's a lot to it, but that's sort of how the needle moves in terms of that improvement. So I know at this point I'm throwing a lot of color maps at you, and wanted to try to include a couple of representations in a more three-dimensional way to sort of see what the changes would be here. So we focused on a couple of areas. The first one would be looking at the brewery, because this, in the existing condition, the 100-year, 4 to 6 feet of water. So we're standing here looking at that point along Main Street. 100-year right now, you're looking at getting up to the first floor elevations, onto the porches, things like that. With all those improvements we talked about, you're back down on the sidewalk. So this is, we talk about the underground, the stormwater, the conveyance. That's kind of the difference we're talking. And again, the 100-year event is a big storm event. It was a little bit different, but along the lines of what was experienced last year. And you can see that, again, it's just to toggle through that one more time, a fairly dramatic difference. So another area we looked at was at the west end, in front of West End Service, looking to the west, where the water under the 100-year storm now would be about 4 feet deep, and then getting deeper to 6, up to the windows of the cars. You get that down with these improvements. Does the road still flood? It's a 100-year storm. It's still going to flood a little. But what you're seeing is it's the difference between going well into the first floor elevations and into the cars to below the doorways, near the middle of the wheels. And so it's a dramatic improvement there. Again, noting that a 100-year storm is a very big storm event and is very hard to manage. So these are just a couple examples, and of course, as we go forward, we're able to create more like this to kind of represent what we hope to achieve. So Lower Main Street, that's the one area that all these things, you still saw some color, and I hope you're hanging with me. I know this is a lot of stuff. I can see everybody's like, oh my God, this just keeps going. This was kind of a big idea. Again, came to us through the CAG, and people wanted to know, could we do this? If we did it, what would it look like? We said, well, we can model it, and we can see what it looks like. And that's the concept of, can we build a tunnel to make the water go around downtown? And modern engineering, everything is possible, so we said, let's model it. We looked at two areas. The first one would capture Hudson Branch upstream of Lot E and take it to the Patapsco. That one's 13 feet in diameter. The second one would capture the New Cut Branch, take it to the Patapsco. That one's 15 feet in diameter. To give you an idea of the size of that, you can sort of see the scale of a man standing in the tunnel. These are very large tunnels, but obviously would carry a lot of water. As you would expect, it's pretty effective. You can look at the lower end of Main Street and see, all that water's been taken out of there. Now, is that a really big idea? It absolutely is. Is that going to get built next month? No, it's not. But again, we wanted to examine everything, all the ideas that you brought to us, and look at what they could do conceptually, and this was one. So, jumping into the last part of the presentation, and it's kind of, okay, we threw 18 stormwater facilities, a whole bunch of things out there. Obviously, that can't all occur, it's not a snap of the fingers, it's a long-range process. But out of the 18 sites, we wanted to recommend a few that were deemed most effective within the model as the ideal initial steps towards improvement. And those were the large Tiber Pond, that first pond upstream in the New Cut Autumn Hill, the 2940 loop ramp, and then the underground pipe farms at Roger Carter as well as along 29. In addition, we included in that the conveyance improvements. So again, still a lot of stuff there, but a subset of the overall picture we're looking at. So our baseline 100-year, see those first 3 ponds, moves the needle a little bit. You can see, going back and forth, it starts to change things. We add the storm drains in there. On top of that, gets a little bit better. And you look at the west end, you can see the flooding depth shrinking. Even down towards Lower Main Street, things are getting a little bit less. Again, these improvements represent incremental improvements in flood frequency and depth. It's not a all or nothing proposition. We add the underground facilities to that initial set. Again, you're seeing, look at the west end, you're seeing some dramatic improvements there. The parking lots as well. So, again, every bit that you sort of add on to it gets us a little bit closer to that goal. So I just want to close up looking at a couple of other things here. This is the 7:30 event we showed at the beginning. If we took all the options that we talked about tonight in the model and put them out there, with the exception of the tunnels, that would be the change. Where you're looking at 2 feet of water in the west end, still 4 feet of water down in Lower Main Street, but the rest of the area, when you look at what was happening that night, again, it's a lot of work, and it does improve the situation considerably. Now, the last thing to point out, and this was a question that came up frequently too, is what happens if the Patapsco floods like it did in Agnes in '72? Well, what we're talking about tonight doesn't address that, to be honest with you, and that's because the Patapsco watershed is a very large watershed. It's mostly outside of Howard County. And if that occurs, there's still a zone, which is sort of represented in pink down here, where in a 100-year FEMA floodplain is what's represented, that water is still going to back up. What this study focused on were the type of events we had in 2011 and 2016 with the flashy thunderstorm and type of things, but just a caveat that the Agnes type event still comes at the town from a different side and doesn't necessarily get affected by these improvements. So, in closing up here, next steps, again, I can't emphasize enough, these are concepts. These are concepts to demonstrate how much the needle can be moved in terms of flooding, but there's a lot of further examination. It's going to be part of this larger master planning effort that you heard about tonight. There's going to be additional cost-benefit analyses associated with this, and it's all going to go into a long-range plan, which will be dictated by how much it costs and how much funding is available. That's the realities of where we are. Now, we did come up with some very rough costs associated with this. Very rough, but I want to throw them out there anyway because I know the question will come up. So those first 3 ponds, we said, who are the 3 best ponds to look at? $13 million. We throw the underground back in there. Again, we get that additional improvement. That's $15. Conveyances, the pipes, the cross culverts, things like that, 5 to 7, depending on what the utilities are that are impacted. If you look at all 18 stormwater projects, about $85 million. It's a lot, but these are very big initiatives. It's a lot of water that we're looking to store here that we looked at within this study. Now the tunnels starts at $60 million, takes detailed engineering to know how high it goes. But again, you asked for that, we wanted to include it in the overall analysis. So just to wrap up here, hopefully I stayed within enough time for questions. This expanded model is going to be another tool for looking at alternatives within the master plan. We can continue to run all sorts of different scenarios through it. There's a lot of options that have been identified so far, but there's a lot of detail, impacts, costs. All this is going to evolve as we move forward. And again, it's a long-range effort. This isn't going to happen in 2018, 2019 in a whole. I mean, it's going to start today, but we're looking at years to decades to fully implement something of this scale. Again, our recommendations are associated with starting with what we deem to be the most effective and efficient approaches And we'll continue to refine that analysis as the detailed engineering goes on and we work with the master plan group. The county is going to develop timeframes in the coming months. You're going to hear more about that, I'm certain, and I'll let others speak to that. But then also recognizing that there's always going to be some threat of flooding. We're talking about improving our odds. We're talking about improving, lowering the depth of water in a typical storm event. We're talking about reducing the frequency of flooding. But we're not talking about a binary, yes, it floods, no, it won't flood. It's always about improving our chances. And again, the Patapsco event is outside. That sort of requires a different set of solutions and analyses to look at that. So I want to throw that out there. So thank you all for your attention. I know there was a lot of stuff, especially in the second half, and I look forward to answering questions and hopefully helping explain better.
Yes, thank you, Chris. A lot of labor and a lot of love went into that, right, Chris?
A lot of labor.
All right. So we're opening it up for Q&A again. We've got quite a bit of time. If you've got a lot of
here
questions.
They come. Okay.
So we're going to keep Chris on his toes for a while longer.
Okay.
If you can say your name, just so we know who you are.
My name is Alan Schneider. A lot has happened in the last 50 years, and I was wondering if your study might take into consideration what might happen in the next 50 years and plan against that, because I know that there are some things. You've looked at the cost analysis. Mm-hmm. There are some things that can be done today at no cost that will not cost something to mitigate later. And we really appreciate your broad experience in other jurisdictions, so you may have some insights that could be, and I'm asking if you will, let us know what works or has worked that you've examined in other jurisdictions where they have protections in place that prevent the damage before it happens. One developer that I heard here in the county said, well, above Ellicott City, they don't have to take into consideration any downstream damage, water damage, stormwater damage from the development they're doing. I think that there's probably other protections, stormwater protections, development protections that would help us in the next 50 years, because as you know, and as we've learned, the storms are becoming bigger and more frequent as climate changes, and there's a diagram about that. I don't know whether that's part of your study or not. It sounded like it is not.
We use the latest precipitation data as determined by NOAA, which has changed over the last few years to be more indicative of recent climate, but we do recognize that it's that it certainly will continue to change, yes.
Are there recommendations that you will make that will cost nothing to prevent damage in the next 50 years? For example, you mentioned zoning protections, development, land use.
I think it sounds like definitely a policy type question, which is probably better answered by folks in the county, but certainly stormwater policy will always have an impact on runoff and flooding. And so, things that can be done in that nature do have an impact and should be considered, but it's definitely a very broad scope of discussion for that.
You've got a lot of experience. I'm wondering if you will bring that into the study, but as part of your study, whether you will include it.
I think absolutely. I mean, if I'm called upon by the county to offer, my feedback on policy changes and things like that, I think certainly within what we're looking at, with what the master planning team is going to look at, it's all going to be geared towards smart development and reduction of runoff and doing things that can reduce existing areas from running off.
Sounds like at this time it's not a part of your study because it's not a part of your assignment.
Well, what it is, again, we recognize that every small effort counts, but we focus really on the broad brush initiatives, knowing that there's a lot of water. And sort of what we need to do to really move the needle is beyond just those incremental improvements, as much as they are all helpful in the long run, that we had to go well beyond that if we're going to really change the flood frequency.
Yeah, Val, thank you. I'm just wondering what the scope of the study is.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that there are two things that we're discussing tonight. One is Chris's work on the H&H study and recommendations that come out for specific stormwater management improvements that are very targeted. Chris is obviously his team is going to be involved in the master plan process. And the question that you suggest really is, what I'm kind of reading between the lines is that no cost, well, I'm not sure that it won't cost anything, but I think what you're suggesting is somehow tying development requirements to zoning regulations to minimize impervious cover. I think that's what I'm kind of hearing from you. And that's all going to be looked at as part of the master plan process. Nothing's really off the table. The master plan process is one where we want to get input, and we'll be looking at different scenarios. But I think it's premature to answer that question until we get into the master plan, into the meat of it, and we look at different scenarios and run those through the H&H model to see, okay, if we look at a different zoning regime, how much does that move the needle? Is that something that we should be looking at? So,
great, thank you.
Dan again. Question about your no development model.
Mm-hmm.
You made the comparison when you had the no development model to the current model, and you said that, even with no development, there'll still be flooding. My question is, how did you come up with your no development model? Were you looking at historic maps of the area?
It's based on a scenario that may never have existed in terms of the entire watershed being wooded. So the runoff coefficient for pavement versus woods is about 4 times higher. Water runs 4 times more off of pavement than it does off of a wooded area. So we changed the calculation to assume that the entire watershed was covered with wooded areas.
So you didn't change the contours of the earth, any of that stuff?
Correct.
Because all that has been changed by developments that does affect water flow. And to just put the woods back there, it's not a fair representation, and I feel like it minimizes the impact that those developments have had on our watershed.
Without getting too in the weeds in the technical part, there is a minor change that'll occur from the shaping of channels and things like that. Largely the shape of the watershed, geologically speaking, hasn't changed. So even if a developer levels off a terrace to build houses, overall the top of the watershed's 100 feet higher than the stream. Water's going to flow downhill. It does change a little bit, but that change in elevation between here and here sort of really governs the speed of the water.
Yes, but water runs much faster down a slide than it does steps. So when you have these developments that you're not taking into account their topography, you're just putting woods into place, you're not having that rough natural slope of the land, you're having the flat developed land. It's not a fair representation, I feel like, to compare that model with what's currently happening. And I have to believe there are historic maps, topography maps that show what the area was like. I have to imagine going back a long time, there are maps that show you the topography of the area, and that it just seems like you're minimizing the impact of development. That seems to be the elephant in the room, that the county has been allowing these developments with subpar stormwater controls, as we see, and then plans in the future to develop more.
Relative to the undeveloped model, I can say my professional opinion, getting in the details of how the modeling works, that there would be maybe minor changes to that, but overall, within 5%, give or take, those changes from contouring the land in certain areas wouldn't affect that change. It wouldn't be a dramatic change. I think relative to, we could have looked at historical maps, but I'm certain that as long as there have been people living here, whether they were Native Americans or citizens, the whole watershed hasn't been wooded. Those trees were cut down to build things way back when.
I agree. I know the town will flood. I do come from a stormwater background. I worked for Montgomery County Department of Environmental Protection with the Rainscapes program, so I do have an idea of what a natural forested area is going to absorb versus a development where you just pretend to put trees on it. And I think that no development model is just minimizing what the impact the development has had, and that's more of a statement than a question. So
okay.
Thank you.
Fair enough.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lisa Bledsoe. I live here in Ellicott City, but I work for Baltimore County's stream restoration section and their environmental protection. I just had a question about, I know with a lot of our projects, we hire consultants too, and engineering and everything, but it starts with the assessment that includes the natural resources, the existing natural resources. So when I hear things like pipe farms or tunnels, what comes to mind is fish passage or water quality.
Absolutely.
I understand that Ellicott City is a very unique circumstance, and there's
is.
only so much you can do, and there's lots of variables. But has any of that been taken into account with the proposed?
We've had informal conversations with representatives from MDE regarding these concepts in terms of, again, the special nature of Ellicott City. As I noted, in the 21st century, we typically don't build online stormwater ponds anymore, but this being a special case, is something we wanted to propose, and we threw that out in a, like I said, in an informal way. And MDE said, given the circumstances, we're willing to consider that in a very general sense.
Okay.
Relative to the pipe farms, of course, that storage would occur offline from the stream, so it wouldn't affect fish passage.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't too clear on what the pipe farm was exactly. And you mentioned, since it'd be underground, you could develop above ground for recreation. You're not talking about impervious surface, I'm hoping.
No, like the Roger Carter, for example, that site along Ellicott Mills, the idea would be to excavate, put these ponds underground where they could store the water, and then on top you could put an athletic field or park or grassed area or something.
Okay.
So not so much necessarily build a shopping mall on top of it.
Right.
Or lot F, you could build the parking lot back on top of the underground facility.
Oh, it was already there. Okay. All right, thank you.
Great, thank you.
Hi, Frank Durante, West End. The estimate was about $85 million.
Roughly.
For this, roughly?
Yes.
Do we have that money? So how realistic is this, and how long do you think all these projects would take? Will I be 80 years old?
Sir, I don't know how old you are, and I'm not going to hazard a guess.
I'm 60 right now.
Frank, you don't look 60. No, let me say that, because heck, I don't want these guys to have to be estimating how much time. $85 million, if you just look at the $85 million, even if you did 8.5 a year, that's 10 years. I mean, and I'm telling you, we have basically a $95 million capital budget every year. So it'll be tough, but I know that I'll work with Councilman Weinstein and the rest of the county council. We'll figure out how we can start the process moving. But it's not going to happen tomorrow, as Chris says, but we can have an incremental way of trying to figure out which are the best things to start with first, and he's given us some ideas of that, and then we can try to see what we best can do. The goal, of course, is to get it all done, but it's going to take time. And we met with the FEMA folks right after the storm. They asked me one time, they said, how long do you think it's going to take for us to get through this and get everything back? And I said, a few years. They go, Alan, it's going to take you over 10. It just takes a time to get the infrastructure all into place. So we're committed to doing it, but we're just going to take us time, and we'll look at the best way we can do it.
And you're going to have to ask, like, BG&E permission, the state, to get that 2940. So, I mean, have you approached them anyway?
The state has been approached, yes. BGE has not been approached.
Okay. So these are all just...
Again, these are concepts. At this stage, that's all they are.
Okay. All right, I have one more question. I think tonight you see a lot of people that are really concerned about development. We've been told many things in the past. Burgess Mill was one. It was going to be the state-of-the-art. It ended up releasing a tremendous pond that went into people's houses and businesses. Also, so what's the motivation doing all this work that we're doing today, still allowing development to continue right on top of Ellicott City as we speak?
I mean, I would have to say that question is beyond the scope of my role in this. I think that's
I understand, Chris.
So your point's well taken, but knowing that what we need to do goes well beyond controlling development. It's controlling development and then so much more. This study really focused on the so much more, knowing that there's a subset of activity associated with the development on a county and policy level that would be occurring as well.
Thank you.
How you doing? Ron Peters.
Hey, Ron, how are you?
Doing well. I like all the projects you've proposed, Of course, as we know, it's going to take a lot of time. But one of the problems that I see, and I asked you about it last time we met, was the Arch Bridge.
Yes.
And
We did look at
I
that.
asked you if you could model how many cubic feet per second could fit under the arch bridge, because at that time you said, well, it's about 2,900 cubic feet hitting that point. So how many feet will fit under the bridge? Andrew said he could do that. I was wondering if he took the time to do it.
We did, actually. You know, what's on there right now, the height of that culvert is, Andy, help me out, 6.5 feet right now?
5 feet.
Less than that. With some sediment, maybe there's a little bit more.
Okay.
Looking at the elevation of the roadway, considering cover for utilities and things like that, right now the culvert section that's downstream under La Palapa is 14 feet by 16.5 by 14 high.
Correct.
We can't go 14 high with the roadway and the brewery where it is now. We could go as high as 10 feet.
Okay.
So we'd be able to go 10 feet and then the existing width of 14 feet. Right now, that arch culvert doesn't get our 10-year storm through. It doesn't fit our 10-year storm. If we were to improve to that 10-foot height, make it a box, it'll get somewhere between the 10 and 25-year storm through it. So it's still not ideal. Anything beyond that, we'd have to talk about changing the roadway elevation and impacting some of the buildings. So there's a, you know, we are looking at it, and it is part of the analysis, and we have looked at the general details, but it always comes back to that next level of impact and how much additional benefit you get. And that'll be part of the devil in the details as we go forward.
Because, yeah, that's where I see the 2011 storm. It backed up. Something clogged up the arch bridge. Down Main Street, the water went. And then this storm, Frank's car got stuck going through the arch bridge.
And I think looking at that bridge, too, in the immediate term, there might be some things that can be done just to make, in terms of embedded boulders in there, to make it work a little better.
Okay. Because I believe that blockage there and backflowing is what really caused a lot of the damage on Main Street.
Yeah, that's definitely, I mean, that spot where the water's in a deep channel takes a hard right turn and goes under the buildings.
And then it hits a little arch bridge, and it's like,
yep.
where does it go?
It's a challenging area in terms of conveying the water.
Second question, do you see any problems with putting the underground pipe farms with all the bedrock that's in the area?
Only insofar as that it costs more money to excavate bedrock than dirt. And we did factor some broad assumptions into our costs for that. But that is, I would say, in a very general sense, when we looked at the cost estimating, bedrock is the biggest question mark. Where we don't encounter it, our costs will be lower. Where we encounter more than we made assumptions about, it will be higher. And we know there's a lot of bedrock in Ellicott City, and that's the only way to know for certain how much that is to go and do borings as part of a more detailed engineering effort. But that's definitely on the radar as one of the challenges, yes.
Now, you said there was 800 acre-feet of water came down from that last storm. How many acre-feet will safely fit under the Phoenix before flooding starts?
Safely fit under what?
The Phoenix restaurant down at the lower end of Maine.
Well, it's more of a flow than a volume. When we look at that, it's more of a flow than a volume. I don't know that number offhand, Andy. I don't know if you do. I know you're putting it on the spot there. Yeah, we can get back to you with it, though. We can look at the model and pull that data out.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Yep.
Thank you.
Hi.
My name is Bill Withers. Just trying to get my head around the models. It's the first time I've seen this stuff, and I'm sort of visualizing it. So I know that you didn't cover the a backwater effect from the Patapsco.
Correct.
But is it inferred in your, because there's going to be increased flow, so when you're doing flow coming down and then the volume that collects, is that kind of impacted or inferred by what's happening with the Patapsco as a barrier?
So if the Patapsco gets up really high, then that area in the pink will be further impacted relative to if we had the coincidence. I mean, generally speaking, when you have a big event like Agnes, it takes longer for the Patapsco to crest than it would for downtown Ellicott City. Under a worst case scenario where you got them both at the same time, it would.
So like July 30th, the Patapsco probably didn't provide a significant barrier to drainage.
Correct, because most of the Patapsco watershed wasn't even getting rain.
Right.
It was really just what was coming out of here in the general surrounding area. But it takes a larger tropical event to impact a watershed of that size.
Okay.
Agnes was really a textbook example of that.
So, and then if we put in all the cool stuff that we want to put in, is there an impact on the Patapsco and downstream of this right angle confluence or discharge from the Tiber Hudson? So, if we put in all the tunnels and the, bigger culverts and all that stuff, is it going to, does it have a place to go?
It's, again, with the idea that most of the storms, the type of storms we looked at are going to rush through town before the Patapsco has a chance to come up. You know, the worst case scenario is when we have an Agnes type event with an embedded storm that sits over and causes that. Patapsco is hundreds of square miles, the watershed. This one's 4. So, you know, it's sort of a drop in the bucket kind of thing. Does it have an impact? Very slight impact on the Patapsco. I mean, it does have an impact, but
I mean, I'm just talking about locally, like right at the railroad bridge, or right where the Tiber Hudson drains in to the Patapsco. If we increase all that flow, which makes us happy up here, I mean, does it just go across and smack the other bank?
As you're saying, in terms of increase, if we just did the conveyance improvements without the stormwater management, we get the water through. I mean, the problem with that is we do all those, let's say we put all those great pipes in West End, but we don't do any management. Whoever's downstream of West End is going to get that water faster.
Yeah.
And that's why it's important to have that two-pronged approach.
Okay.
So that's true in general, yeah. If we move the water through town faster, whoever's at the end of that water is going to get more of it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yep.
Adam, again. 3 quick questions for you. One, will we have access to this study? Will this be something that we
I
can?
believe it's going up. Is it going up?
Presentation's going online tomorrow, and then we'll have the final written study within the next week.
Excellent. I appreciate that. Next, your 100-year flood, is that over the course of 24 hours?
It is, but it's worth noting. So the shape, we showed that hydrograph, it's kind of like a bell. It's called a 24-hour storm. The majority of that water falls in about a 4 to 5 hour.
Okay, because that kind of came to my last question was, in your experience, which do you recommend for the faster moving water, the underground volts or the ponds?
At the end of the day, a cubic foot stored is a cubic foot stored no matter whether we put it underground or above ground. Above ground is cheaper where you have the space.
Of course.
And unfortunately, we don't have the space everywhere, and that's where the underground comes in.
So they'll come in to either at the same speed?
Correct. It's really all about just holding on to that water, waiting for the storm peak to pass, and then letting it out so that that peak is diminished.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hey, my name's Kip. I was wondering if you'd be looking at kind of the prioritization of the stormwater management alongside relative risk for damage of each of the properties. So maybe looking at shear stresses or depths and when that damage would occur instead of necessarily just depth or area.
Well, it's a good question. You know, it can, as far as a cost-benefit analysis, we can factor in more than just the volume. You know, it's one of the reasons why the, you know, that initial group of ponds included one from each of the sub-watersheds, you know, to try to spread that around so that folks that are in, because of course, you know, the Newcut and the Tiber really only affect downtown, whereas the Hudson, you know, a lot of that affects largely the West End. So, you know, we wanted to spread that around, but we can look at things like velocity and shear force and the impact on, you know, an individual pond. I mean, no single pond or underground facility is going to be a huge magic bullet, but, you know, it's really a cumulative effect. But knowing that some are going to be a little bit more effective than others initially, and relative to their cost, that'll all go into the
I think
decisions.
It was more of like the definition of effective being based off of area or depth or damage.
Right.
So
it's
looking maybe at the damage characteristic with the master planning could be beneficial in their prioritization, potentially lower costs. There'll probably be a point of diminishing return that may be helpful to look at. Then also, I was curious if in the stormwater management scenarios, and I know this is tricky from a modeling perspective, but looking at active stormwater management, kind of a new stormwater idea for retrofitting ponds, but also new ponds. Opti is one. Tell them that I said that, and maybe I'll get a check in the mail or something. But that lowers the water levels kind of based off of storm inputs. Timing is really important in that. So.
And we did look at, so that within the existing ponds, the best information that we had available, there's about 15 acre-feet of storage that is wet storage, which is to say it's a wet pond that in theory could be dewatered with that system and then brought back up. So again, it's not a huge improvement, but every little bit helps. And so that is on the table. That option is part of our considerations.
Okay, great. And then I was curious, be fun for you guys modeling this too, if as improvements are made, if there's any intention of putting monitoring equipment in and seeing based off of what you've modeled how the effects are actually, you know, kind of putting that back in to calibrate your model further.
Well, there are some
improvements made.
stream gauges that are out there now on the Hudson, and when we get precipitation data, that can be further. So if we got another event-type storm, we would certainly seek to pull that data into the model and further refine it. Yeah.
Yeah, and just that it could be useful in terms of figuring out how effective the improvements are, both in conveyance.
You're saying going forward, putting in additional gauges. Is that what you're saying?
I don't know what the gauge system is currently, but
using them to check our effectiveness once we actually
do some sort of improvements. Yeah.
Yeah, we'd love to do that. That would be interesting.
Recommendation. It'd be interesting. And then another gentleman that had to leave was curious about and this might not be for the modeling side, but he wanted me to ask about an early warning system, or if that was in the works. I'm not sure. I said I would ask. So
okay.
About storms you're talking about?
Right. An early warning system when stages get to a certain height.
I don't know. Is there anyone in the county that can answer that about?
I mean, the Office of Emergency Management has been looking at that part of our systems. Our stormwater management division is a part of our emergency management procedures, and they're looking at stream gauges and how best to use that information out to the public. So they're
Thank you, and good work.
Thank you.
We have about 10 minutes left, so.
Okay. Melissa again. So I have two questions. First, we can assume that this study includes all of the potential solutions, not only the solutions that were brought up through the CAG or by the community, but including you and your engineers best thinking about how to address this issue, correct?
I wouldn't say all. I mean, what I would say is we looked at, particularly in terms of stormwater ponds, we looked at more locations than you saw tonight. We wanted to focus on the most effective ones. I mean, there are always infinite permutations of putting storage here, there, and everywhere. And that's where the details will work out. Some of these ponds you saw tonight conceptually could move up or downstream. They could change location, based on that. So there was more than what you saw tonight that was looked at initially, but there's sort of a line and you got to say, all right, we're going to choose this group and go with it and see what happens.
Okay. Thank you. And then you mentioned cost-benefit analysis pretty quickly at the end. The approximation of the costs would be clear, but I'd like to know more about how the benefits will be calculated, because I think this is really where the rubber is going to meet the road in terms of budgeting and county council approving the budget and everything. And I mean, we have one way that you can look at benefits are foregone costs. So we know the cost of public infrastructure repair from the July 30th flood. We have the economic analysis in terms of the losses in revenue to businesses as well as tax revenue. But one thing that for which there's not currently an estimate is the damage to private property, including buildings and also business equipment and inventory. The case study that is available through the county's website calculates about $3.4 million in damages to private property. However, a few of us in just about 10 days of sort of volunteer time and talking to people identified another $11.1 million. So that shows first of all, 3.4 is extremely low. Second of all, with just a little bit of effort, we were able to identify 11.1 million more. So I'd like to know, and this isn't a question for you perhaps, but maybe for others in the county government, how will the benefit side of the equation in terms of foregone costs from a flood of this type be calculated and included when those decisions are made?
Well, I could speak to the cost benefit. The foregone costs, I'm going to defer to others on that. It's a little outside of my H&H expertise. But I can tell you, when we talk about cost benefit on the H&H engineering side, what we're looking at is how much are we reducing the depth of flooding for a given event or the frequency of flooding? How many properties experience that improvement, and how much does it cost? I mean, those are metrics. So, it can also be related to just, again, volume of storage. We know the more water we store, the more effective we are at reducing the flooding. So we can kind of tie those metrics together, look at the number of properties impacted, and come up with calculations that way. There's a lot of other things it can be related to. So I think our team will look at the hydraulic improvement side, and then others will probably delve deeper into the economic side of it.
Okay. I mean, Can anyone else speak to that economic side of it, or not at this meeting?
Sorry. So I mean, Chris explained the cost benefit from their standpoint. So the additional question was, and correct me if I'm getting this wrong, or please if you.
So a benefit, a benefit from additional stormwater management would be that the private property owners do not incur the costs of their properties being damaged, their inventories being lost, their business equipment being destroyed. Obviously, this is not necessarily a cost that the county would bear, but if you look at it from an economic perspective, it is something that needs to be taken into account. That cost has not been calculated for the July 30th flood. So is someone going to calculate it?
I mean, as we look at, as Chris explained, as part of, looking at the volume reduction of water on Main Street, I mean, that's what we're looking at. As far as your point is the case study, the flood work group is meeting with the case study consultant on June 12th, to discuss, those estimates there. So I know we've talked to Melissa on this multiple occasions. So I'm happy to continue the conversation there. But I really want to make sure that there's other folks in line to ask questions about the study that we have tonight. But we do have the discussion with the consultant on the case study on June 12th. So if folks have more questions on that, that might be the.
But what I'm hearing you say is that you're advocating for looking for a broader, Melissa, a broader analysis of benefits as part of this going forward. Okay, thank you.
Hi. I'm Elaine Pardo. I'm inferring from what you haven't said that anything that individual citizens and businesses and government installations in the watershed, anything they could do, like more trees, less grass, permeable pavement, like if this whole parking lot was permeable, would not have a significant reduction effect?
It all cumulatively helps. Within the scale and the scope, we focused on the big things because, to be frank, if we looked at a 1 acre lot and changed that from pavement to pervious pavement, right downstream of that lot, it's going to make a big difference. Within the 4 square mile watershed, it's not within the tolerance of our model. But all of those things are positive for the watershed as a whole, and if we do enough of them, then they move the needle.
If you could put some kind of numerical benefit per acre, it might be more of an incentive for us to do what we should have been doing all along.
Okay, duly noted. Thank you.
Thank you.
Barrington again. Speaking as a resident of West End, I would just like to say the McCormick-Taylor study back from 2012, in the zone of 8600 block, you guys projected it would be 5+ foot of water. You were right on. So you guys were good. You were good. And we got the same amount. In that same area, you had zones, and in that same area, we had 5+ foot of water. So the other thing I wanted to say was that I've been there 56 years. My mother's been there 85 years. She's never told me of a water coming down the street like that. So I've never experienced it until 2012, 2015. So if there's talk about it ever happening before that, I don't know about it. My mother doesn't know about it. I've never heard any talk about it. So I've never seen any pictures of it, if it does exist. The other thing is, with all the improvements that you wanted to do, pond here and some underground storage tanks, West End, it seems like the whole watershed area, 90% of it improves. But West End still has 2 to 4 foot of flooding. The upper West End has, now what else can we do to that area that can reduce flooding even more? Because there's nothing really particular in that area that we're doing. I mean, this is with the double pipes you want to put at the 8600 block, the dry pond right above that. What else can we do with that stream so it doesn't come out into the road? Because in that area, there's plenty of room for more drainage because the road tilts. It's almost like a ditch. The road tilts to the inside of the curve, and that's where the water starts. But then the water in the creek comes up, and what else can we do in that area? Even with your double pipes at the end of the 8600 block area, it still floods. You said 2 to 4 shown on your map here.
This sounds like a level of detail conversation that I'd love to have with you. Maybe not right now because I think we'd have to dive into the maps and talk in detail, but I'd be glad to sit with you and talk about it at some point in the near future.
Okay, so I guess we need to have that conversation if you don't
can
mind.
Talk
Appreciate it.
to Phil and his folks, and we can set something up.
Please, thank you.
Good evening. Lost my picture here. Joel Hurwitz. When you talk about the 6.6 in 2 hours, that seems to be an oversimplification of the event. That it was, I guess, 1.7 inches on the 28th and 1.9 inches on the 29th. And looking at the storm intervals, that it was, we have here, that in 5 minutes was 0.8 inches, that in 15-minute period was 2 inches, that in a 30-minute period was 3.2 inches. Do you know how all those, one, that the ground was wet the prior couple of days, and when the maximum interval of rain caused the maximum amount of flooding?
Yes. So
how much are we really talking about that caused the maximum?
The peak intensity at the moment, it was taken, the data was in 3-minute intervals, and the peak intensity was, I believe, 9.2 inches an hour. Now, it wasn't like that for an hour, but it was like that for a 3 to 6 minute period. When we did our model, we took all those data points of varying intensity and input that into the model. So it's not just the 6.6 in 2 hours that got thrown in. It's a curve and a shape of varying intensities throughout the storm in order to create that peak that you saw in the hydrograph. So we did take that into account.
So is there a amount of rainfall in inches that caused the maximum amount of flooding that you can quantify, that people could start talking about, that if it was really a 4-inch rain in a 1 hour period, we're going to have the same damage?
Well, it's not, again, no two storms are alike. So, saying you got 4 inches in an hour or 6 inches in 2 hours, those are both very intense storms. If one only lasts 1 hour, it's going to be a smaller storm because the volume of water is going to be less. So it's not, I guess you can't oversimplify it down to a number, I guess what I'm trying to say. There's multiple dimensions to it. There's the dimension of time and intensity that factors in and creates the shape of a curve, and the shape of that curve is different every time. It's hard to...
And how much was the saturated ground contribute to the slope that people have talked about?
We have a fancy term called antecedent moisture condition, which is figured into that. It is factored into the model as well.
So if it had been dry, would it have been
slightly
different?
It would be about the difference of about 1/10 of an inch of rain. It's about 1/10 of an inch of rain to saturate the ground to the point that you get runoff, so it wouldn't have made an appreciable difference.
Thanks.
Yep.
So there are, Beth again, there are a couple of proposed projects at 2 government sites right now, one for this complex and one for the courthouse. And I was wondering how much those projects had been factored in. Were they part of your original modeling, or did you take a look at them, and how much water will they retain?
They were factored in a rough sense because they're not designed yet. We looked at doing a basic, we call a curve number reduction method for those areas to show as part of the improvement. We didn't mention it because it's within the overall 4 square mile watershed. Again, does it move the needle at Lower Main Street a lot? No. Immediately downstream, and particularly, like, I'll use the courthouse example because that's one that we're designing. That immediate area downstream, the water that comes down Church Road, it does make a more significant impact in that portion of the watershed. I mean, I think when we talk about these smaller things, I want to make clear that we're not dismissing the impact of small improvements, but just that when you do a model of this scope, there's sort of a resolution to it, that gets lost. Small things get lost in the big picture. But when you look at the smaller area, when you look at the area immediately downstream of it, that's where you see, an improvement. And so, and every bit of water that's improved coming down Church is that much less it's going to shoot out into Main Street, and so on and so forth.
So you just said you're designing it, so that's great because it'll be included in all of your bigger plans. But what are you trying to design it for? Is it 100% retention in a 100-year storm? What are you shooting for in your designs?
Trying to maximize the storage of runoff. So it's looking at the site and maximizing how much water we can keep on site before it's released.
So you don't have a real number yet?
Not that I can quote you off the top of my head. We do. I don't think I got to stop putting you on the spot. It's not fair.
We should get you a microphone, really.
So-
Okay, we'll email.
Okay.
Just a quick question. I'm John Shoemaker. We have a business on the street, and I live on the street too. In your modeling, were you able to determine the effect of the failure of the Burgess Mill Pond?
In terms of the breaching?
Yeah, like how it affected.
We didn't include that in the modeling.
Okay.
Yeah, that was sort of more of a micro scale than.
It was about 2.5 feet difference in the water level in our basement.
Oh,
when
I'm
it
sure. I'm
failed.
sure in the immediate vicinity, it made a dramatic difference.
Right.
We didn't include that in the overall model because, again, the 730 model was based just on the precipitation and running it through. We didn't look at any individual dam breaches. We just didn't go that granular on it.
If the storms are that bad, how do you account for maybe more than one pond failing?
Well, again, a couple of things come into play. One, you've probably heard people talk about that as a 1,000-year event, which if you look at a 3-hour time interval, that's what NOAA would categorize it as. So was the facility in question designed to handle that? Quite possibly not. Could there also have been blockages that came into play? Was the pond fully dredged? Was there something blocking? We don't know. That's the other thing when we talk about these models and what they actually did in real life. None of this takes into account when big trees and cars get stuck in culverts and things like that. So that's not always factored into the model.
All right, thanks.
Yep.
Final question.
Thank you. Hi, Bruce Taylor. First, I want to thank you for the detail of your depth and breadth of the study and attaching some economic numbers to getting things done. Just as a quick comment, Rob Vogel is the engineer who designed the pond that failed, and he also does a lot of work for me with developments. And he and I did a back-of-the-envelope calculation about the quantity of water from the storm, and it matched pretty much your very much more detailed and thorough model. So I give that as a little bit of background to say that in that context, Mr. Vogel estimated that the failure of the Burgess Mill Pond contributed about 0.2 of a second worth of water to the water that came into the town over those many hours. Couple of questions. One, have you looked at all at the possibility of dredging down the Tiber and Hudson channels, even possibly dredging some of the Patapsco down to increase the depth of water that those can carry as a possibility?
Well, unfortunately, we're up against a couple things in that regard. One would be bedrock. As you know, when you get water with this amount of force and over time in a confined channel, it tends to scour itself down to bedrock. And a lot of those channels where they've got the stone walls, that are on either side, particularly in lower Main Street, if you dig down further, you undermine the stability of the walls. So there's a real, given that those walls are often supporting the buildings above them, anything to destabilize their foundation has a very significant impact on the structure above it. So that's a real limiting factor when you get into the highly developed section of Lower Main Street. But also the fact that in most cases through there, it is already cut down to bedrock. So you wouldn't be able to dredge so much as drill, and there's a whole suite of things that come with that. So.
Thank you. And the second question was, I appreciated your comment about creating some ponds along Newcut. And one of the suggestions that I had made was the possibility of creating a dam that would not retain water except in the event of a flood, so it would allow normal flow to come through. And I wondered if that's something that you've looked at in your areas of creating the ponds.
That's what our model represents. For reasons of fish passage, among other things, we would want to convey up to what we call the 5-year event. So we're not looking to have those ponds fill up every time it rains. We're looking to have them fill up when the amount of rain is a danger downstream. So when we did our model, it was based on letting pretty much the full channel through and then storing what would be flooding out of the channel.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
So first of all, wonderful questions. So you all took an enormous amount of information in that's quite complicated and came up with some really great questions, and I think improved all of our understanding of what this model represents. But I also want to say a special thanks to Chris Brooks for being up here for such a long time and handling every single one of those questions. So thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Yes, you can sit down now. Yes.
All right.
And so now I'm going to bring Val back, and he's going to conclude with the next steps.
Thanks, Steve. And as Steve said, really great questions, great presentation. Thanks to Chris and his team, Tom McGilloway and his team, everybody who's kind of stuck it out as late as it is. Again, the focus on tonight's discussion, was really on stormwater management, but there's much more for the master plan process. The master plan is going to be looking at placemaking. It's going to be looking at transportation, parking, streetscape improvements, business development, all these various things. So while tonight's focus was really on the flooding issue, there's much more. So please stay tuned. Please stay involved. Again, we're going to be coming back out in July. Everybody who signed in will get a tickler on that, and we really look forward to your continued participation and patience. I know everybody wants to get going with, some of these major improvements, but places like downtown Frederick, that took 30 years from the point of thinking about it to the point where it was actually realized. So with that, I'm going to close. Drop your comment forms at the back desk there, and we'll see you soon. Yes?
They've been taping tonight. It was live streaming too, so this will be on the website, I think, tomorrow. So it'll be available for anyone else who wasn't here. You let folks know they can watch what you guys saw tonight.
Great. Thank you, and again, see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I know. Yeah. I was getting, my back was getting sore up there.